Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. It is the 20th of May today. Joining me in the studio for today's programme and to help me analyse and discuss today's news is the former SNP MSP Sandra White. Hello Sandra, how are you?
I'm fine, Gordon. Thank you very much and good evening to you.
Okay, thank you Sandra. We'll be talking to Sandra just shortly, but before we do that, first of all, the coronavirus update. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,988,629 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,757,761 have been confirmed negative, 230,868 have tested positive. There are 432 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 0 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 7,664. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 83 were in hospital last night, 5 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,063,648 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 1,742,772 had received their second dose, including me, incidentally. The latest UK daily figures show that 127,701 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 7 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. And now to tonight's main headlines. Failures in England's test and trace system are responsible for a surge in the COVID India variant. Downing Street has confirmed there was what it called a short delay in tracking down the contacts of people who tested positive for coronavirus for several weeks, a failure being blamed for assisting the spread of the variant first identified in India. According to local public health reports, the shortfalls in the £37 billion English test and trace system during April and May affected 8 local authorities in England, including Blackburn and Darwin, one of the areas closely linked to the India variant. This involved more than 700 positive tests not initially reported to the local officials. Blackburn and Darwin had the biggest single number of cases where local authorities did not have access to full data on positive tests to allow them to track down contacts who might have been exposed to the virus. Laila Moran MP, the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus, said that the government has serious questions to answer over how failures in its test and trace system have contributed to the surge in cases of the India variant, adding that it appears that not only did ministers fail to prevent the Indian variant entering the UK, but that grave errors were made in tracing cases in the hardest hit areas. Ms Moran said, Matt Hancock talks about the government having a sword and shield against the coronavirus, but their approach has been more in common with a leaky colander. The government must urgently confirm the number of cases that were missed and what is being done to prevent this from happening again. They need also to fix the failing test, trace and isolate system, including by providing proper financial support to those who are self-isolating. Well, Sandra, the government's test and trace system has been widely criticised as being very late, vastly over budget, and doesn't seem to be doing its job, does it?
It certainly does not, Gordon, and I'm glad you had your second jag. I had mine last week as well, so I feel at least we're moving on. Basically, there's 3 areas in this particular one. There's what they call a short delay. I would say that 3 weeks, that's how long the systems were down in these 8 local authorities. I wouldn't call that a short delay. The second point is the fact that flights were allowed to come in, even though they were on the wet list. That is just unforgivable in that respect. And the second point is regarding spending money on the system. So much public money has been given to Tories, both Boris Johnson and the Tory government. You've got to ask yourself, When's an investigation going to come about? I know they've said next year, but it really has to be sooner. The fact that millions have been spent, wasted of public money to their cronies, and now we have this, what they call a technical fault, and yet they're still allowing people in from red countries, obviously India as well. So I think it's a complete and abject failure by the UK government to, really get to grips with the COVID-19 virus and all its forms.
Certainly, when the test and trace system was introduced, it was, lauded as being a great British success story, and it was going to be the best in the world. But history seems to have shown very much the opposite, doesn't it? Because when the government gave the money, and I've heard it said actually that this particular investment in a public health authority or in a public health emergency is actually the third most expensive government intervention in the history of government interventions across the world. And yet it seems to have delivered something which just doesn't work.
Absolutely, Gordon. As I said, it's an abject failure, and questions really do have to be asked. And I know that they're talking about, obviously, an inquiry, and I think it's next year, sometime April next year. But that's not good enough. We need to have an inquiry just now. So what is it the UK government, Westminster government, going to do? Pour more money into this? I mean, how can a technical fault not be discovered for 3 weeks? So people were landing in from India in a red hot spot where really they shouldn't be flying, shouldn't be allowed in without isolating, basically. So they had 3 weeks in their communities, in these 8 local authorities. And the local authorities, which are responsible for them, doing their best they possibly can, have no way to track and trace, then isolate these people. It's an abject, it's criminal actually, to think that, I mean, I obviously, I was in the Scottish Parliament, I sat on the Health Committee. We poured over all of the installations, technical installations of Greater Glasgow Health Board and many others as well. And if there was a fault, we were really, what I would say, on it straight away. And yet here, 3 weeks down the line, a technical fault could not be discovered in time to make sure that these authorities and the people who were working on the ground were able to test and trace and isolate the folk who were affected. It's criminal, really.
I did hear today, Sandra, that there were several prominent public health officials interviewed. One particular expert said that the answer should have been, rather than a centralised UK system, it should have been devolved out to the various local authorities, and each one of them given a job of tracking and tracing and allowed to collect the information themselves. Do you think that would have been a better solution?
I think absolutely a better solution. And obviously, if you want to have someone central to oversee it, because obviously in Scotland we have all the individual health boards who had, a main central point, but we're also working very locally. So it was so easy to find when you take the flu virus, for instance, when people were coming to elected members and saying, I haven't had my JAG, etc., etc., we were able to contact the local authority, the Greater Glasgow Health Board in my case, and we could find out why this was happening within a couple of days, really. So yeah, absolutely, the centralisation of it certainly hasn't been helpful, but I think it's been shambolic, and local authorities and people on the ground who are working there are really are better, trained to cope with this type of thing. And I think if it had been more localised, you could have nipped it in the bud so much quicker.
Well, Sandra, we'll just have to hope that whatever it is, the £37 billion that's been spent hasn't just simply gone to private companies. Anyway, let's move on tonight, Sandra. Still talking about the coronavirus and the news that 2 AstraZeneca COVID shots are now 85 to 90% effective. 2 doses of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccination may be around 85 to 90% effective against symptomatic disease, Public Health England, or PHE, announced today, while cautioning that it did not yet have enough data to be conclusive. The vaccine rollout in the UK has generated a lot of data about the use of the shots in real-world settings. PHE said that the preliminary findings were the first of its kind on the effectiveness of 2 doses of AstraZeneca in a real-world setting, but it cautioned that it had low confidence in the findings and that the results would be inconclusive until more evidence was gathered. In a weekly surveillance report, Public Health England said that the estimated effectiveness of AstraZeneca vaccine invented by the University of Oxford was 89% compared to unvaccinated people. Vaccine uptake in Scotland has been very high, particularly amongst older and vulnerable groups. Well, interestingly, Sandra and I were talking about this very subject just before we came on air, weren't we, Sandra? And the fact that we have both had the AstraZeneca vaccination. Are you pleased to hear that, at least as far as we know so far, the effectiveness of this vaccine is so high?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pleased to hear if that is actually correct in that respect. And I would say to anyone who's listening to the programme or watching the programme to please go and get tested. Not tested, but absolutely get your vaccination done as well. Because the big problem is a lot of people read the other side of the news. Whilst we're saying this is a very positive outcome, some people are still, hearing that it's not so good in that respect. It doesn't protect you. And I would say, please go and get the JAG. Because if these figures are correct, and I don't doubt that they are correct, to think that you're really 90% safe not to get COVID is fantastic. So I think we should be, looking at this, I wouldn't even say cautiously actually. I would say that if we've got these figures, even if it was 60 or 70%, it's still a good percentage when you consider how many people, unfortunately, have lost loved ones and people have got long COVID, etc. It's got to be a good news story.
Certainly, obviously the scientists are always very reluctant to say that something is like 100% or that they're certain of anything. They always want to collect more data. But with the number of vaccines having now been delivered, it obviously is that data is going to start flooding in larger numbers very soon. But I was just thinking that 90% of whatever it is, 2.5 or 3 million Scots who've already been vaccinated is a fantastic number, isn't it?
It is, as I say, it's a fantastic number, and as I said previously, I would certainly encourage, everyone, if they're able to go and get this vaccine, because it can save your life, not just your life, but it can save other people's lives as well. So I think it's something that, we should cover, in the media, not just here in broadcasting, but throughout the media, and say to people, even if it was 60%, 90% is absolutely wonderful. Even if it was 60 or 70%, still a good news story.
It certainly is, Sandra, and it would be worth having the vaccine even at that level. Okay, we're moving on now, Sandra, going abroad this time to the Middle East, and hopes of an imminent ceasefire in Palestine have receded. The Israel and Palestine forces halted their fire for several hours early today amid efforts to reach a truce, although intense rocket fire and further airstrikes throughout the day dashed hopes of an imminent ceasefire. It was not immediately clear if the 7-hour quiet, the longest since the attacks began 11 days ago, was part of an agreement that broke down or just a temporary lull in the violence. A Hamas official had earlier said a ceasefire was in reach, and Israeli media reports suggested the military believed its goals had been largely met. The pause in violence came a day after the US President Joe Biden, who had largely avoided public pressure on Washington's ally, told the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he expected a significant de-escalation to take the situation towards a ceasefire. However, the brief calm between 1 a.m. and 8 a.m. local time was broken when air raid sirens sounded in Israel near the Gaza frontier, and Israel's military said a fighter jet had struck a rocket launcher. Later, militants fired an anti-tank missile at an empty Israeli military bus near the frontier, lightly wounding a soldier. Yesterday, both sides in the conflict had denied that a truce was imminent, but efforts are continuing amid growing international calls. Israel's Security Cabinet is due to meet this evening, with local media suggesting a ceasefire will be discussed. France has circulated a United Nations resolution adding pressure on the US to demand a ceasefire, and issued a joint statement with Egypt and Jordan that called on the parties to immediately agree to a ceasefire. They said that they would work with the UN and other partners to ensure humanitarian help for the population of Gaza. The US has already said the resolution would undermine efforts to de-escalate the violence. The UN Middle East envoy Tor Wennesland was meeting the Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh in Qatar, Al Jazeera television had reported. A 193-member United Nations General Assembly was due to discuss the conflict on Thursday, with the participation of several foreign ministers, but it was not expected to take action. Now, Sandra, we've been watching with growing horror the unfolding violence in the Middle East and the seeming tit-for-tat exchanges of rocket fire, airstrikes, and both sides seemingly not willing to stop yet. It's unusual, isn't it, for this to go on this long? Normally, Hamas is fairly quickly subdued by the sheer might of the Israelis' military power, but this time it seems a little different, doesn't it?
It doesn't seem different to me, Gordon. I remember Operation Cast Lead. I have been over in Gaza, the largest open-air prison camp. That is exactly what it is. And I've been in the Shatila camps, and I've visited the hospital too. This is like a David and Goliath story, and it's not fair. You know, it's so disjointed in both sides. Basically, you mentioned there about Netanyahu. I've listened to the speeches that he has given. He is not going to give in, basically, until the Palestinians, as far as I'm concerned, might be strong words that I'm saying here, but I don't regret saying them. The Palestinians are basically wiped out, and they're no longer in Palestine, which they obviously wish to turn into whole Israel with settlers. And we talk about Biden. We need to remember that Biden is the one who has given billions of dollars to Israel. We also need to remember that the UN Security Council, the USA, were the one country that didn't support a ceasefire. We also have to remember that the UK sends weapons to Israel. They also send troops to train in Israel against the Palestinians. So I don't think it's an unusual situation. I think if you look at the history, you'll see I think it's nearly every 7 years now, Operation Cast Lead and others, it seemed to come in troughs. Now, whether that's because, the world forgets, which unfortunately they seem to do, and therefore the Israelis feel they can push on ahead, or whether it's just the fact that the Palestinians will not give up in regards to wanting their land in a state of Palestine. And the one thing that I found quite confusing there was when they had said that a fighter jet. Now, Palestine, Gaza in particular, can't even get parts into that country through the customs, through the security, even for fire engines, for necessary repairs to machines, etc., etc. So I don't know where they get the fighter jet from, but the violence on both sides absolutely has to stop. But the fact of the matter is, Israel is
it was an Israeli fighter aircraft, I believe, Sandra, which had attacked a Hamas target. One of the things I was trying to understand, Sandra, was the fact that it seems, at least this time, that the Palestinians and Hamas have been more successful this time in penetrating Israel's air defences than ever before, because they haven't just simply launched a few dozen rockets, they've launched hundreds of rockets. They have saturated their air defences. And if, according to some reports, they've actually damaged an oil pipeline. They have narrowly missed a nuclear power station. So Israel is maybe not looking quite as secure as it once was.
I like the use of the word, Gordon. I'm glad you cleared up about the fighter jet, because it wasn't clear to me. According to comments, I'd like to see exactly, the figures. If you look at the figures of people killed, mostly children, you're over 200 in Gaza alone. Well, basically Gaza is there. And unfortunately, I think it was 8 in Israel. They have this massive dome that stops anything from coming over. So I would like to see actual figures and an inquiry into exactly if Hamas, who are wrong to be doing what they are doing, but as Palestinians and others say, you have a right to defend yourself in that respect. And I would like to see how they penetrated this dome. But I think what's happening, which happens every, let's say, 5 or 7 years, people go and demonstrate, people see what is happening, and I don't think Israel this particular time are getting away with the fact that I think they get away with these things with impunity. But the world has changed slightly, and people are going out and are demonstrating and are listening to what people who are living in Gaza are going through at the moment. And they're not accepting it. They're not accepting it. And perhaps the media has covered it more. I just wish there could be a ceasefire. Basically, I wish they would get round the table. Do I think that will happen? No, unfortunately, I don't, because I've seen it so often. But it's not just about this particular conflict. It's much deeper than that. When you look at the map of Palestine and you see Gaza and how shrunken it's become, and obviously you see through the media the Israeli settlers taking over the land, then I really think it's time that Gaza and the West Bank and the occupied territories were opened up, legitimately opened up, for people to go and see exactly what is happening there. And it needs people on all sides to get round the table and say there has to be a solution to this. And the solution isn't the fact that they're fighting, they're bombing, and children are dying. The solution is Palestine is Palestine. It was there. It is a state. It is a land. And something has to happen to ensure that the Palestinians can live in their land and the Israelis can live in their land peacefully. Do I think that'll happen? Sad to say I don't, unless somebody takes control of this and perhaps an investigation in The Hague. There's been investigations for a number of years now and nothing has worked. And I would love to see a solution to this problem. But until people are blocked on their sides, and obviously, as I say, I've been there, I've seen the suffering of the Palestinian people, the camps, Gaza. Israel has got to stop. This is a David and Goliath contest, but the Palestinians have a right to live and a right to justice. And at the moment, they're not getting that and haven't for, over 70 years.
Okay, Sandra, thank you very much for your detailed answer there. Moving on, this evening, the Scottish Greens have called for an urgent eviction ban extension. The Scottish Greens today called on the Scottish Government to extend the current eviction ban for as long as coronavirus restrictions remain in place. Asking an urgent question in Parliament, the Highlands and Islands MSP Ariane Burgess called for a temporary eviction ban to be extended as long as restrictions remain. The new MSP also called for government to work collaboratively to deliver a better deal for Scotland's renters. Now, Sandra, this is a story which has cropped up repeatedly during the coronavirus pandemic, and it was a bit of a mystery, actually, as to why the the moratorium on evictions from properties suddenly ended when it did. Can you tell us anything about that? Because I know the SNP probably wanted that to last longer, but it seems to have come to an end a lot sooner than many people thought it might.
I think, well, certainly, I mean, I think it should be extended. I do, because I think what happened was when you looked at the coronavirus and, the SNP government brought in the legislation, to make sure people weren't evicted, I think that they thought that restrictions would ease and the coronavirus wouldn't, reoccur. This is the third wave that we've got now. And I think that's where it's come in. And I certainly would, I don't need to plead with anyone, but I'm certainly confident that the government will look at this again, considering we are on a third wave and people still can't get to work. People are still suffering, they can't pay rent. And I understand in certain circumstances where people have rented accommodation. I know people who that's their income. Maybe they've got one or two flats, that's their income. So I can understand where they're coming from in that respect, not the huge big conglomerates that have these private rented accommodations. But I also feel for the people who are renting and are not earning the money. They've still got to pay utility bills. These things should be looked at as well, actually. These are essential public services. They've still got to pay them, and they don't have, the money for the rent either. So I would hope that it would be extended until the coronavirus is actually not a third, a fourth or fifth wave. But I think the intentions were obviously good intentions. It was put in place by the SNP government because the coronavirus was there. I don't think anybody expected it to last so long. So I would be hoping that we look at this again to extend it. That would be my hope anyway for the new minister that's there as well.
Okay, Sandra, thanks for that. Let's hope that the SNP are listening this evening. Moving on now, and losing Batley and Spen by-election would be curtains for Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer should resign if Labour loses the Batley and Spen by-election, the former Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott has said, suggesting that the party's left wing would endorse a leadership run by Andy Burnham. Her intervention comes as Sadiq Khan became the second prominent Labour mayor to reach out to the rest of the country, writing in the Yorkshire Post about breaching the divide between the North and his city, London. Khan, widely considered a future party leadership contender, visited North Yorkshire on Wednesday, just a week after his re-election, which his team described as a clear statement of his intent to build bridges between London and other regions. Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, has also raised eyebrows on the party for a new column in London's Evening Standard and for comments in an interview with The Observer in which he made clear that he would run for the leadership again should Labour fail to win the next general election. Labour faces a major test in the forthcoming by-election in West Yorkshire seat of Batley and Spen after its MP, Tracy Brabin, was elected mayor of West Yorkshire. The seat has a slim majority, but it's been Labour since 1997 and is likely to be a close fight with the Conservatives. Support from the large minority ethnic electorate may enable the party to hold the seat and Starmer to hang on as Labour leader, Abbott said. But if Labour loses again, it must surely be curtains for him. And then it may be that Andy Burnham's time will have come. This is an interesting one. We have again this schism in the Labour Party between the left wing and the centre-right, as evidenced by Keir Starmer. And we have a seat which looks like it's going to be a wafer-thin majority. It's going to be really a difficult job for Labour to hold it. Do you think there's any chance that Starmer would resign if this by-election is lost? And is there any chance, do you think, that Labour members would demand his resignation?
When you look at the results of the council elections, they're just 10 days ago. Basically, he didn't resign then. In fact, he looked for other scapegoats, as you might say, who he, according to him, had organised it badly, the council elections. So I can't see him resigning, unfortunately. I can see the Labour Party, and it's not for me to tell the Labour Party down south in England how to run their affairs, but I can see some of them who left wing, as you might call it. I'd call them perhaps even moderates. Just people that want social justice, basically. I can't see them, rebelling against the leadership per se that they have in the Labour Party just now, because I think the rot really set in the Labour Party when Blair decided that he would go a third way and basically emulate the Tory party, which he very successfully did when he got elected. And then, of course, when you were going up to Brexit, the Labour Party leadership, instead of completely against it and completely against, some of the stuff that was said, which we're seeing happening now about immigration, etc., they actually went along with that. There's nothing to put between the Labour Party and the Tories in England, and that is a big problem. And they have lost such a lot of support. There's nothing else to choose. So I think the left will come in if they do lose this, but I don't see Keir Starmer resigning.
Do you think, Sandra, that the recent collapse in the so-called Red Wall support in the north of England is an indication of the voters choosing to abandon the old socialist Labour ways and actually to put their trust in the Conservatives instead? Has there been an abandonment, do you think, of the socialist, so we say the socialist values of the Labour Party by their own voters?
Well, certainly, when you look at some of the areas, really working class areas, people who believed in, socialism and a fair deal for all, certainly it's a real shock for everybody. It must have been even more so for Labour that they have abandoned them. But, you look at basically industry now. I mean, obviously when Labour were strong, you had the mines and that type of thing, huge big car factories, etc., and that was a real stronghold for a Labour vote. Unfortunately or fortunately, in the case of mines, etc., and coal, they are no longer there at all. So their core vote has actually disappeared, I believe. And the other issue is the fact I think Brexit has a huge part to play in this. When you look at some of the diatribe that came out of the Tory, not just Tory party, but Farage and others, and in some cases Labour, during Brexit, British jobs for British people, immigration, Labour didn't shy away from that. And yet the people, when you see interviews on the TV, people from working class areas in England say the same things as they told, people are taking their jobs. So there's really more to it, I think. I think in a lot of these areas, not everyone, but obviously it must be a majority because they voted Tory in, actually see these values of Britain, Great Britain, empire, as part of their values, unfortunately. And they don't see an international picture. They see this very enclosed picture of Britain. So I think you need to look at Brexit to see, apart from obviously going back to Blair and how they're emulated, but if you look at Brexit and what the Tories and Farage and these other right-wing parties stood for, and obviously the Tories get in, people voted for that, and that's the biggest worry. It's a change of culture, I think, in these areas, not necessarily the change of how people are voting, although that leads to
the attitude to people migrating to the United Kingdom has changed, do you think?
I honestly do think that, and it's quite sad because, not everyone feels that way, but you can see by the majority. Look at the majority the Tories have got, and it seems to be that's the whole culture of how people thought. It's changed.
It's very sad, Sandra, that the British people seem to be wanting to pull up the drawbridge. Anyway, sadly, we'll have to move on. And staying in the UK for our next story, United Kingdom civil servants have been given just days to prepare for a £2.9 billion aid cut in 2020. UK civil servants were given 5 to 7 working days to prepare for 30% cuts in the overseas aid budget last summer, including a £730 million cut to bilateral aid that it later emerged was unnecessary necessary. The cuts were agreed in July 2020 on the basis of a single forecast reduction in the size of the UK economy, which was shown to be too pessimistic. 5 days later, the cuts package was signed off. Ministers spent only 7 hours discussing the proposed £2.9 billion cuts to multilateral and bilateral aid, and then imposed them predominantly on the world's poorest countries, despite giving instructions for the opposite to happen. The damning findings come in a report by the government's own independent commission for aid impact. Commenting on the UK government cuts to Rohingya refugee support, the SNP's international development spokesperson Chris Law MP said that the Tory government had already ploughed ahead heartlessly at eye-watering speed with unlawful cuts to water and sanitation projects across the world. Yemen, the Syrian refugee programme, Syria, Libya, South Sudan and girls' education, despite manifesto and legal commitments, and they are now disgracefully going ahead with cuts to the Rohingya refugees. These many and brutal cuts will cause untold damage across communities and nations across the globe and global aid uplift efforts. In contrast, the SNP Scottish Government has consistently committed to international development projects and support with the limited powers it has, including a £10 million fund for international development, and it will increase the aid budget by 50%, said Mr Law. So Sandra, this is a very sad state of affairs that the United Kingdom government based its aid cuts on a botched prediction of how big or how small the UK economy was going to be after COVID. And yet, despite it being wrong about the level of shrinkage of the UK economy, it pressed on ahead despite all of this. And the only people that are going to suffer will be the people that they were trying to help in these other countries.
I know. I was shaking my head when you were reading out those figures, Gordon, and you had said previously it's rather sad how this is happening as well, and it is. It's not just sad; it's absolutely criminal. And when you look at some of the countries which they are taking aid from or denying aid to, these are some of the countries that the UK have went in with weapons and etc., and sold weapons to, and all of that stuff, took part in wars, and yet here we are in a ridiculous situation where we are cutting that aid. Now, people always say, it's a well-known fact, basically, if you're comfortable with yourself as a country, you want to help other countries, even if you've not been one of the countries who have invaded them or whatever it may be. You see the suffering and you want to help. Individual human beings want to do that, and therefore they want their government to do that as well. So for them, for the UK, the Tories, to go ahead and cut it by such a phenomenal amount, billions, and give civil servants a couple of days, really, to do that without even going to the House of Commons. Well, the House of Commons, yes, but there doesn't seem to be anything that stops the Tories from these terrible decisions, which they just don't seem to care. It doesn't matter to them in that respect. But really, when you look at the history, and I had to correct you from the previous one regarding the British, in Scotland, we welcome, immigration and
Yep.
refugees also. We've never ever put these things forward. It was put forward, unfortunately, in England by both parties, actually. But when you look at the track record of this Tory government, immigration, dawn raids, the Windrush, Brexit, therefore people can't come into the country from other countries, we can't go out, our kids can't go out. There's a pattern emerging, isn't there? A pattern emerging here that basically it's like, we don't care. And that's probably the saddest thing of them all. We don't care. And even sadder is the fact that the electorate, not in Scotland, because gosh, I can't, 1953 or something was it when we had a Tory government, not in Scotland, but unfortunately, down in England, people are voting for them.
Again, Sandra, it's surprising. Sandra, if I might take you up on something you mentioned earlier on in the conversation there about the very countries whose aid is being cut. I'm just looking at the script here, and we have Yemen, the Syrian refugee program, Syria itself, Libya, South Sudan. These are all countries in which the United Kingdom has been selling arms, are they not? Or have invaded or bombed at some point in the past. Do you think there is an element of assuaging guilt to the aid programs that the United Kingdom gives? Because they're not that huge, are they?
Well, I mean, it doesn't even matter how much you give. You're supposed to obviously give X amount of your GDP, but to take it away, I just don't think there's guilt there at all. I just don't think they care. They don't even think of the fact that, oh, by the way, we invaded this country, we supported certain regimes and regime changes. That's one of the biggest things that the UK governments are always good at, changing regimes if they don't like them and then causing wars through that. I just don't think they care. I really don't think they care. They have no decency about them. And the saddest thing of all is that people vote for them, absolutely vote for them. Even if
Sandra,
you had
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sandra. Something which somebody asked me the other day was that they felt that Donald Trump had kind of changed the way people in the West, in English-speaking West, view the rest of the world by this protectionist kind of attitude, where countries where people aren't white or they don't speak English are not worth doing business with, and we shouldn't be helping them. Do you think there is an element of that which has now infected the voter population in the United Kingdom?
I do think there is an element, unfortunately. Yes, I do. You just need to look at it on Twitter, no doubt. If there's some people listening to this and watching it that don't agree with my views and they're entitled to do that, then Twitter, or I've got loads of Twitter feeds or whatever it may be, basically. But there's absolutely no doubt about it. And it's been growing and growing and growing. And the Tories have just, I'm not saying they've emulated Trump, because I think they've been about for a lot longer than Trump, and basically, but yeah, there's definitely an element of that, unfortunately, in the voter population.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much, Sandra. I'm sure we'll be talking about this again more, more and more in the coming weeks. Anyway, now to the United States. The US House has approved a Capitol riot commission. The United States House of Representatives yesterday voted to create an independent commission to probe the deadly January the 6th attack on the Capitol by former President Donald Trump's supporters, as 1 in 6 Republicans defied party leaders' attempts to block it. Over the past 2 days, the House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy and the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell worked to kill a bipartisan bill to establish the commission to investigate the violence that left 5 people dead, including a Capitol police officer. But the House voted by 252 to 175 to approve the commission, which was styled after the panel that probed the attacks on the United States on September the 11th, 2001. The bill now goes to the Senate, where its future is uncertain. The solid number of Republicans voting for the independent investigation, 35 out of 211, signalled some cracks in the party's defence of Trump on a key vote. Trump opposes the creation of the commission. All 10 of the House Republicans who voted to impeach Trump in January voted for the commission. The bipartisan outcome could give Senate Republicans second thoughts about working to defeat the initiative. This is an interesting one, Sandra. So, unusually for United States Republicans to kind of cross the floor in this way and to go against their own party, in effect, by setting up a commission to look into what happened on January the 6th at the Capitol and how that event happened. Do you think that perhaps Donald Trump supporters are a bit worried about what this commission might find?
I think they probably are. There's still thousands of them out there who think that Donald Trump is still a good guy and the bee's knees, as you might say. But I mean, I applaud, the senators, the elected members from other parties who did cross the floor, as you said, Gordon, and voted to push this forward. Because I think what they see, that wasn't just an attack, as far as speaking to a number of friends that I have in America, granted New York and different other areas, it wasn't just an attack on Trump or Biden or a particular political party. They see it as an attack on their whole democracy set up in America. They see it as that, and I think that is a very important thing. I mean, watching the scenes unfolding, I must admit CNN gave you some fantastic coverage of it. Seeing them unfolding, it was absolutely terrifying that you had elected members having to hide under chairs. So people I know, and probably lots of others, see this as an attack on the democratic right of the state of America. And that's, I believe, why these other elected members crossed the floor and voted for this commission. And it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of it, because I think you'll see that there are many people who are involved, who members of the security, things like that. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of it.
Okay, Sandra. Well, sadly, we have to leave that story for the moment. On to our final story this evening. And when I first read this part of the script, I immediately thought that Michael Palin was starting a new travel documentary, because Great British Railways is the latest thing from the UK government. The rail industry will be simplified but still substantially privatised, as rebranded as Great British Railways, the government is pledged after publishing its long-awaited overhaul today. The White Paper places control over rail infrastructure and services under a new arm's-length public body, with franchises replaced by contracts that will incentivise private firms on punctuality and efficiency rather on raising revenue. Great British Railways will run and plan the network, as well as providing online tickets, information and compensation for passengers nationwide. It will streamline and simplify fares, including extending contactless and pay-as-you-go systems to more parts of the country. How this will affect the running of railways in Scotland is unclear. The ScotRail franchise is a devolved responsibility. However, Network Rail is a UK government-owned quango. With ScotRail to become a Scottish government-owned public body running the trains there are concerns about the UK government-controlled GBR taking over running the tracks and infrastructure and selling the tickets, since there is already close integration and management of Network Rail operation in Scotland. Now, Sandra, you could be forgiven, couldn't you, when you first heard the title of this, Great British Railways, that it was some kind of travel documentary. But this is a serious paper by the UK government. But it falls very far short of admitting that the privatisation of the rail network several decades ago has been a complete disaster. And it seems to be a kind of halfway house between privatisation and partial state ownership. Do you think there's a future for this idea, or is this just another experiment?
I don't think there is a future for it at all. The railways down south basically are a mess, but they are privatised, continue to be privatised. But, you know, the thing I couldn't go over was, I think this is the usual Tory UK government want to put their UK Great Britain empire stamp on everything. And that's really what it is. They want to rename it Great Britain Rails, etc., etc. They don't care about Scotland or Wales. It doesn't affect Northern Ireland, this particular piece of legislation. And I think it's just to appease people and say, look, we are Great Britain, we're this wonderful wee insular country, and everything's going to have a Union Jack on it. And as far as I'm concerned, that was just basically just, we're just going to do it whether we like it or not. But they'll be up against it in Scotland because obviously we've got ScotRail and it's coming under local government or Scottish government control. Network Rail has always been a problem, and we have asked many a time to take that under our control. That'll be an interesting one, Gordon, to look at in that respect.
Sandra, I was going to just ask you, this system claims that it will streamline and simplify fares, including extending contactless and pay-as-you-go systems, and will deal with information and compensation for passengers nationwide. Now, the problems that the English rail system has faced are largely down to it simply being fragmented into individual franchise areas. And everybody has been complaining, at least in England, about the huge cost of rail fares in England. And Matt Hancock did nothing today, I don't think. He said that he couldn't guarantee that prices wouldn't rise beyond inflation. So it seems that this, as you say, may just be a rebranding exercise and a sort of partial solution to the problem.
Absolutely, Gordon, you're absolutely right. And let's remember, about the new rail lines that they want to open up, which won't benefit Scotland and it won't benefit Wales either. There's billions of pounds for that. How are they going to pay for that? Through the back door, as in supposedly streamlining fares, but basically hiving it off to private contractors, where the fares will go up. It could be a money-making exercise as well in that respect. I don't think it will do anything. I just think, anything that takes the eye off the ball of what's happening with COVID and, people not being tested. As soon as something happens, you realise they come out with some so-called good news story. And I think that's all this is. Takes a life out of everything else.
Sandra, I just incidentally, a personal anecdote was forced to use the railway system between Glasgow and Edinburgh repeatedly during the recent weeks, and I was pleasantly surprised at how punctual the trains were, how clean they were, how well run they were. But there is always this nagging feeling that the fares are too high. If the Scottish Government could do it, do you think we should take over the maintenance of the rail tracks as well and do something to try and control the fares in our own network?
I think we have to take control over Network Rail. The amount of times there's been, trains, stopped and late running, etc. It's normally because of Network Rail, something happening on the tracks. But obviously people know ScotRail, so that's who gets the blame. So I think they've got to. But as the fares go, and somebody had to travel back and forth nearly every day, it's an absolute disgrace, the fares from Glasgow to Edinburgh. Glasgow to Perth even isn't much different return from what it is to Glasgow to Edinburgh, an hour's journey. So we have to reduce the fares, and I know you can buy season tickets or whatever it may be, but it's a lot of money to travel on the rail. It is comfortable, it's cleaner, punctual, but I think you have to reduce the fares as well.
And Sandra, if the Scottish Government is sincere, and I'm assuming it is, in its wish to make people leave the dirtier forms of transport, like their cars, and, for example, flying, when flying from the United Kingdom or from Scotland to the European Union or somewhere else is so cheap. I mean, there are some fares which from Glasgow to Poland were as low as the train fare from Glasgow to Edinburgh. How are we supposed to square that circle? Does it mean that we have to invest more public money in helping to support the fare structure?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I know somebody who's got tickets to go to Barcelona, from Glasgow to Barcelona, and the return fare for that is £22.
That's incredible.
£22 return fare, and that's going in July, if they can get there. They've got them already, basically. But you see, I know that these airlines, I won't name who they are, basically, they have these really cheap fares, but they still make a profit. So where is the money, which you're charged £27 return day from Glasgow to Edinburgh? That must make a profit. So where's that money going?
That's an interesting question. I certainly... the fares... I was going to say, Sandra, the fares on the rail network from Glasgow to Edinburgh are £34 return, which is when you look at it in that context, is pretty high.
Yeah, well, you save, 20 pence or something if you buy a single. And I know that we always used to, if we bought a return and we weren't coming back that night because it was a point 20 pence, we would leave it on top of the ticket machine.
Yeah.
And people knew they could take it. I should probably be saying this, but that's
it was common practice, Sandra. I remember it as well. Listen, sadly, Sandra, we are running out of time this evening, so I'm just like to remind our viewers that, of course, Broadcasting Scotland is still in the middle of a major crowdfunder at the moment. So if you'd like to support the station and support the work that we do, you can do so by following the instructions on your screen now to become a supporter on a regular basis for £5 a month or to make an individual donation. So if you'd like to do that, please do. But just remains for me to thank my guest this evening, the former MSP Sandra White, and from all of us here in the studio this evening, a very good evening to you.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. If I went to BBC Scotland and I said, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country. that need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balance stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.